history nerds and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up Mythology. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from mythology that is super fucked up. Today is part 673 of the Troy series that I am both happy and regretful that I decided to do. But today is the final part. It is so exciting. I am so excited. Let's just fucking get to it. Trigger warning: death, murder, suicide, grief, death of children, sexual assault, the Oracle of Delphi, but this time she's not so terrible, and just like Greek mythological malarkey. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your "oh good god, what the fuck" faces. So the rest of the story of the Trojan War is pieced together over about like 17 different sources. So there's going to be times when I'm telling this where it's like, one version says this, but like one version also says this. So I mostly took this from Robert Graves' book, but I did have to like look up supplemental information as well. So after Hector is burned, the fighting continues. Robert Graves writes about an Amazon that came to Troy named Penthesilea to be purified by Priam for a murder that she committed, and in return she fought for him. And after Hector was killed, she became one of the best warriors on the Trojan side. There are some stories that say that she was one of the only ones who actually had a chance of killing Achilles outright. And one story, according to Graves, even says that she did, and that Thetis begged him to be resurrected, and that later he killed her, then fell in love with her corpse and committed necrophilia. Which makes me uncomfy, but this is effed up history / effed up mythology, so that's just kind of a theme here. So a man named Memnon comes from Ethiopia, and he is also a formidable opponent as well. He kills Antilochus, who was the one who broke the news of Patroclus' death to Achilles when he was defending his father Nestor. So he's described as one of the youngest, handsomest, swiftest, and most courageous Greeks, Antilochus says. And I think that this shows like the loss that can really happen during war. Even the youngest and most courageous and most beautiful are not immune from death. And when Achilles found out about Antilochus' death, he fought Memnon himself and killed him. And it seems like Achilles again is unstoppable. Even the strongest warriors cannot bring him down. But his pride had gotten to be too much. And Apollo was very offended with how he treated Hector and the things that he said to his corpse that we're not privy of. And apparently it was so bad that Poseidon, who had been on the side of the Greeks for the entirety of the war, conspired with Apollo about how to bring down Achilles. In the heat of battle, Achilles chased the Trojans back into Troy and entered the city, and he found himself at the temple of Apollo. He was attempting to take the city for himself and win glory for the Greeks when Paris saw him. Paris, who was world-renowned for his skill with a bow and arrow, fired shots at Achilles, and Apollo stepped in and guided his arrows straight to that one sensitive spot on him, that one spot that would ensure his death, his heel. And Achilles died in agony, but he welcomed his death. There are, however, some versions that say it wasn't Paris at all who did this. It was actually Apollo who disguised himself as Paris, who is one who killed Achilles. But even though Achilles was killed, it was said that he was undefeated in battle and the greatest warrior of all time, because many during this time looked at the bow and arrow as the coward's weapon, because you didn't actually have to enter battle with anyone to kill them. So again, he's considered undefeated in battle. So it's another reason why a lot of the great warriors looked down on Paris as well, because he was just really well known for his bow and arrow and sort of like considered a coward. So a fight then ensues over Achilles' body, but he was defended by Odysseus and Ajax the Great. Ajax carried him back to the Greek camp over his shoulder while Odysseus was defending him. He was mourned for 17 days and nights by mostly the leaders of the army, like Odysseus, Agamemnon, Diomedes, Menelaus, Nestor, Ajax, etc., etc. Those who were close to him, who may have at like one time or another called him a friend. But the lesser soldiers didn't really feel anything for him and his death, because a lot of them viewed Achilles as a traitor for letting a small feud between him and Agamemnon blossom into death for so many of their comrades. On the 18th day, the Greeks built a funeral pyre for Achilles and burned his body, and then mixed his remains with Patroclus's in a beautiful golden urn that was made by Hephaestus and given to Thetis on her wedding day. Now, there are some stories about what happened with him after his death. Some say that he was resurrected and married Helen, becoming her fifth husband, which I'll explain that in further detail a little bit later. Others say that they married in the underworld. Another story says that he married my favorite mythological serial killer, Medea, in the underworld, and they live together to this day on the Islands of the Blessed. But of course, I like to think that Achilles and Patroclus are together in the underworld. That wouldn't have been a thing that was like concluded in Greek mythology, but I like to hope that the underworld is an LGBTQ plus friendly place. Now, once Achilles was burned and buried, Thetis took his armor and said that only the bravest of the Greeks could receive it. And Odysseus and Ajax, the Great, stepped forward because they showed great bravery while they were defending his remains. And they all sort of fought over it a little bit. Everyone wanted beautiful armor that was created by a god. So Odysseus and Ajax are boasting their achievements back and forth, and Nestor comes up with a plan to see what the Trojans have to say about it. So they send a spy to listen to what the young women of Troy are saying about the Greek men, and some of them are praising Ajax for how strong he is and how he defended Achilles' corpse, while others are like, no, that's bullshit. Even a slave would defend their master's corpse from being defiled. It was actually Odysseus who fought more bravely. So when the spies report back to the Greek camps, Agamemnon awards the armor to Odysseus and pissed the ever-loving shit out of Ajax the Great when he did so, and Ajax plotted his revenge. So Ajax's plan was to slaughter all of the leaders of the Greek army because he was so insulted. But Athena learned of his treachery and made him temporarily insane. So he mistook cattle for the great Greeks that he was plotting against. He slaughtered a ton of them, but took 2 back to his tent. For the one that he mistook as Agamemnon, he cut out its tongue and then cut off its head. And then the other one, who he thought was Odysseus, he tied to a pillar and tortured for the rest of the night. The next morning, he came to his senses and realized what happened and killed himself with his own sword. And this whole ordeal was absolutely pointless when Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, arrives and Odysseus has passed the armor onto him. But like, oh my God, we've talked so long about these people. What about Troy? How does this stupid war end that I feel like I'm talking about for 10 years? Well, the Greeks were curious about this too. Their best warrior was dead. Their second best warrior had just killed himself after going mad. So Odysseus and Diomedes go to Calchas the seer and ask him what they have to do. And he said, there's no way that Troy will fall without the bow and arrows of Heracles. Slight problem there. Heracles' bow and arrows were with Philoctetes. A new name? So close to the end, Krystina? Yes, friend. So long story short with good old Phil is that he was gifted the bow and arrow by Heracles. He was the owner of it. He was also a suitor of Helen all those years ago, and so swore an oath and had to come to Troy. But he never made it to Troy because somehow he got a terrible wound on his foot that festered. And Odysseus proposed that they just leave him on the island of Lemnos for 10 years while they fought the Trojans. Well, this certainly puts us in a pickle. And Odysseus, our favorite tricky dude, is like, oh, let's just sail there real quick and go get it. It's only about 50 miles away. I'm sure he's dead by now. We left him there with a super infected foot 10 years ago. And boy, were they surprised when he was in fact not dead, but had been healed and was just angrily living in Lemnos ever since. And he was especially perturbed with good old Odysseus, who came up with the idea to leave him there. And Odysseus, the tricky bastard that he is like, let's just fool him into giving it to us. And Diomedes is like, or we can just ask him for it. Philoctetes is like, totally, I will bring the bow and arrows of Heracles myself, because Heracles actually came to me in a dream and told me that I will be chosen as the boldest among the Greeks. And since you fucking left me here, I have a lot of pent up rage. And he took out that rage on Paris. So he challenged him to an archery duel. Philoctetes' first arrow missed. His second struck Paris's bow hand. And the third went into Paris's fucking eye. And the fourth, in a way that is not at all similar to what we have seen before, hit him in the ankle. Paris was able to sort of like hobble back into Troy and was taken to the nymph Oenone, who was his first lover that he pushed aside for Helen. And she took one look at him and remembered how he slighted her all those years ago, and she refused, because the underworld hath no fury like a woman scorned. And so he died. There are some translations that say that she later regretted this and only told him no in a moment of passion. And later she ran into Troy with all of her healing herbs and found that she was too late. So, quote, this is Robert Graves' quote, In a frenzy of grief, she leaped from the walls, or hanged herself, or burned herself to death on his pyre. No one really remembers which. So we don't remember how this nymph killed herself. That's actually like quite important to the story of Paris. But half of the fucking Iliad consists of random ass dudes who have no mythology, and it's the first and last time that they are mentioned. But we have this like whole ass lesser deity here who I mean who gives a shit about her, because it is a her, right? So now that Paris was dead, Helen couldn't just like not have a husband. So Helenus, who was a man, and Deiphobus, who was Hector's favorite brother, fought over who would have her next, like a hand-me-down shirt. Now, if you ask me, Helen and Helenus sound adorable. It's like when like Christas and Christophers get together. So cute. Expect you to wear matching sweaters. But King Priam steps in and decides that Deiphobus was the better suitor and gave him his blessing. But Helen, who is still filled with longing for her husband Menelaus and wanting to go back to her fucking children with literally nothing to keep her in Troy anymore, tries to sneak out in the middle of the night. But nay, women cannot have a say in their lives, friends. And she was found by a guard and was, quote, married by force to Deiphobus. So Helenus was very upset, and he immediately leaves Troy to go back to his city when he's kidnapped by the Greeks. But he was totally okay with being kidnapped because he had deserted Troy, not because he feared death, but because he could not overlook Paris sacrilegiously murdering Achilles in the Temple of Apollo that no one attempted to make amends for. So he told the Greeks that he would tell them whatever they wanted if they could ensure that he would be given a safe home in a distant land. And Odysseus, who I never trust, promises that he will, and Helenus tells him that Troy will fall this summer as long as the bone of Pelops is brought to the camp. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, takes to the fields, and if Athena's palladium is stolen from her temple. Okay, then. Helenus is like a little bit of a seer, so that's how he was able to tell all of this. So they go and get Pelops' shoulder bone, and then some of the men go to Skyros to get Neoptolemus, who was only about 12 at the time, but like a little fucking terrifying. And then they think on how they will steal Athena's palladium. And wouldn't you know, the answer just walks into their camp. See, the fighting between the sons of Priam had gotten so bad that he sent his son Antenor to Agamemnon to negotiate peace. But Antenor had treason in his heart. He told the men that he would just give them the palladium and therefore the city. All he wanted in return was to rule Troy and take half of the riches when the city fell. So Odysseus, that tricky bastard, dresses in rags and has Diomedes whip him so that when he ran into Troy, he would appear not as king of Ithaca and one of the leaders of the army, but as a runaway slave. And Helen was like, yeah, sure, of course you are. I've known Odysseus for years, and you don't look like Odysseus at all. You are clearly a slave of the Greeks. Get me the fuck out of here. So then he leaves without her. But what he does do is steal the palladium while he's there. There are other translations that the Greeks got the palladium different ways, but him getting the shit beat out of him and disguising himself as a slave doesn't make sense. So he gets the shit beat out of him. He disguises himself as a slave, breaks into Troy, and then leaves. And then, goes back to Troy with, Diomedes to steal a palladium, which Odysseus may or may not have tried to steal from Diomedes. And then they build the Trojan Horse to sneak back into Troy again. So it doesn't make sense. If you're going to dress up as a slave and get whipped and, break into Troy, then, just steal it while you're there, you know? So, yeah. Now, we are finally at what we've all been waiting for, the entire reason why I even chose to do the story of Troy in the first place. And 44 pages of single space notes later, I am finally here. Outside of Troy, there was a horse. Not just any horse, but a giant wooden horse. Now, the horse was the symbol of Troy, so it wasn't just some random animal that they chose sitting out there. And on the horse, they carved, quote, "In thankful anticipation of a safe return to their homes, the Greeks dedicate this offering to the goddess," meaning Athena. And the Greeks were gone. Overnight, they had burned down their camp and sailed away, and it seems like the Trojans won the war. So Priam comes out with some of his men and they debate what to do with this giant wooden horse. Some people said that it should be brought to Athena's temple because it was dedicated to her. while others said that Athena had favored the Greeks the entire time, and they should either burn it or break it open and see what's inside. One man even throws a spear at it to show his discontent. But Priam ruled that it should be brought to Athena. She caused them enough harm during the war, they didn't want to upset her further. Maybe now that Paris is dead, she'll get off their fucking backs and forget the whole apple for the fairest thing, right? The horse was so large, it couldn't even make it through the gates. It actually broke the wall into Troy, but don't worry, they repaired it so that no one could sneak in. But Cassandra took one look at it and began screaming that there were armed men inside and they should get rid of it immediately. And no one listened, because no one ever listens to Cassandra. But then another seer confirmed this. But before the arguments could begin again, a Greek named Sinon was brought into Troy and confirmed that actually all the Greeks had left. The Greeks were sick of war and they wanted to leave months ago, but the weather didn't really permit it. Before we left for Troy, we had to sacrifice Iphigenia, so we figured that there must be a sacrifice needed this time as well. So we asked Calchas, and after 10 days, he named me. And just as they were about to kill me, the winds changed, and they seized their opportunity, and I barely escaped with my life, and they deserted me here. And as for the giant horse, well, you see, when we stole the palladium from Athena, she was so betrayed that we lost her favor. The palladium literally burst into flames the moment that it arrived in camp, so we built this large horse to honor her, and also you as well. You didn't bring it in the city, did you? Oh no, we made it so big hoping that you wouldn't be able to get through the gates, because before we left, Calchas also told us that if the horse made it into the city of Troy, Troy would get all the troops of Asia to join them in their invasion, and they would conquer Greece. With this, the Trojans celebrated, but they shouldn't, because everything that Sinon said was a lie. So what actually happened was a few days before, Athena went to a man named Prilus and whispered in his ear to suggest that they should get into Troy by means of a large wooden horse. Now, of course, it was Athena's idea, offered to the Greeks by Prilus, and then it was later built by a man named Appius. But, of course, that tricky twat waffle Odysseus took all the credit for it. So they built the Trojan horse out of fir. And in case you were wondering what kind of wood it was, we can't remember why Oenone killed herself, but it's important to know that it was specifically fir wood that built the Trojan horse. And then in the dead of night, the Greeks burned down their camps, and all the Greeks got on their ships and sailed just out of sight, while 23 or 30 or 50 or possibly even 3,000 men climbed into the horse. That is also another literal quote from Robert Graves, by the way. That's not me being sarcastic about how many men there were. There were either 23 or 30 or 50 or 3,000. So the entire time while they were debating what to do with the horse and bringing it inside and conversing with Sinon, the Greeks were just chilling inside. Most of them are nervous, except for fucking Neoptolemus, because he's a psychopath. Remember how I mentioned that someone threw a spear at the horse? It embedded right next to Neoptolemus's head, and he didn't even fucking flinch. But Helen, I mean, she's super smart, and she immediately understands what's happening. And so she's walking around the horse with Deiphobus, her new husband by force, and she's imitating all the wives of the men inside, to the point where they are trying to jump out of the horse to get to her, to get to who they believe their wives are out there. Now, depending on what book you read, she may or may not have known what they were doing, and that there were Greeks inside of it. Some translations just say that she assumed that's what happened, and then some say that she was completely in on it and understood exactly what happened and had a really big part in Troy's downfall. So that night, the Trojans partied hard. They slept hard. They passed the fuck out. And while they were sleeping, the Greeks snuck out of the horse and into Troy. So some ran for the gates to signal to the Greeks waiting on the boats to come. Some silently took out the guards, and Menelaus and Odysseus ran straight to Helen, the former contemplating killing her and the later wanting to save her. So when they made it to Deiphobus' house, they engaged in what is regarded as the bloodiest and hardest battle of the war that was ended when Helen plunged a dagger into her new husband's back. Menelaus, who had all intentions of killing her, looked at her and his heart swelled, and he brought her to the safety of the ship to bring her back to Sparta. King Priam was taking refuge with his wife and daughters at the altar of Zeus when one of his sons was murdered by Neoptolemus right in front of him. Priam tried to retaliate, but Damian from the ancient Greek version of the Omen killed him and dragged his body to his father's grave to let it rot. Again, Neoptolemus is 12. It was complete pandemonium. Trojans were being killed before they even knew what hit them, and while they were still sleeping. Cassandra ran to the temple of Athena, clutching a wooden sculpture that was like intended to replace the palladium that was stolen by the Greeks. And she was praying to Athena for help, even though the goddess hadn't helped the Trojans the entire war, when Ajax the Lesser came in and sexually assaulted her in Athena's temple. It was so bad and so offensive to the virgin goddess that it said that the replacement palladium kept its eyes upturned towards the sky as if horror-stricken. Ajax the Lesser then dragged her back to the Greek camp to make her his concubine, which was the common fate for Trojan women. But when the Greeks heard what Ajax did to Cassandra, they were appalled. They were angry. Agamemnon was pissed off to the highest, and he announces to the entire army what Ajax did, and Ajax was hated by all of them. And then Agamemnon, in his fury, took Cassandra as his own concubine and assaulted her. But it was okay because it wasn't in Athena's temple, and Agamemnon is like now known for just stealing women from other men, so it's totally fine. Although there's some versions of the story that say Ajax didn't do that at all, that he didn't sexually assault her, and Agamemnon, when he saw Cassandra, just decided that he wanted her for himself and got Odysseus to spread these rumors about Ajax the Lesser so that he could have her. So once the Trojans were sufficiently massacred and the treasures were split amongst the Greeks and sacrifices were made to the gods, there was then the question of what to do with the remaining survivors, especially the women and children. So the first one in question was Hector's son Astyanax. Now, after some back and forth, Odysseus recommended that all the descendants of Priam should be eradicated and then hurled baby Astyanax off the wall of Troy. Now, there are some stories that it was Neoptolemus who did this because he took Andromache as his concubine and prize. This is the only version that I knew, and that is why I mentioned that I thought Neoptolemus was evil incarnate at the age of 12, but it seems like I might have been wrong. And even if Neoptolemus was the one who actually like killed baby Astyanax, it was Odysseus's idea. Why do people like him? Odysseus, that is. Like, he tricks everybody. He only ever looks out for himself. He's a baby murderer. And the entirety of the Odyssey consists of him continuing to trick people, blinding a Cyclops, cheating on his wife multiple times, lying to his crew, watching as every one of his men dies, tricking his son, lying to his wife and father, and then viciously murdering 108 men and countless female servants who committed the crime of trying to marry a woman that was believed to be a widow who respected her wishes, to wait until she finished a project that lasted like 20 years. Odysseus is not great. Unless I am missing something. Like, he's one of the most intelligent mythological figures, but like, and this idea of his led to a lot of children being murdered, not just Astyanax. Priam had anywhere from 50 to 69 sons, remember? And like, many of them were grown and had children of their own. There is one story of a little boy named Polydorus who is different than the other Polydorus that we mentioned, because Priam just started recycling names. Like, you know, you can only have so many like Hectors and Parises and Polydoruses. You just had to start recycling them after a while, right? So Polydorus is Priam's son, but he's raised by a man named Polymnestor. So Agamemnon bribes this caretaker Polymnestor, who had raised Polydorus as his own. Agamemnon offers his daughter Electra if he murders the little boy. But Polymnestor couldn't bring himself to do it because he swore to protect Polydorus. So instead, Polymnestor killed his own son and passed it off as Polydorus because a pretty new wife is more important than your child. Oh no, that may have been some like self-projection there. That said a lot about me there. So later on, Polydorus learns that from the oracle of Apollo who his parents actually were and what Polymnestor did, and he blinds Polymnestor before stabbing him to death. Another time I don't hate the oracle, I suppose. So back to the spoils of the Trojan War, and by that, of course, I mean the women of Troy. The next one to be argued about is Polysena, who was the sister of Cassandra. When they were debating what to do with her, Neoptolemus stepped forward and said that his father Achilles came to him in a dream and demanded that he be sacrificed at his tomb because it wasn't fair that he didn't get his gifts, and he would have the winds withheld until they did so, which I didn't think that just like regular dead mortals could do. Like, I thought withholding the winds was something that only the gods and goddesses can do, but apparently Achilles in the afterworld becomes storm or something. So yeah, Agamemnon disagrees with this and was like, dead people don't get gifts. Like, yeah, he did a lot. Not so much in the Iliad, but like in the years before the Iliad and like in the 3 days after Patroclus's death. And I find this very interesting because it creates a parallel between the beginning and end of the war, when Agamemnon was like totally okay with his daughter being sacrificed to bring back the winds, but he wasn't okay now with this woman being sacrificed. And like maybe it says something to how war changed him, or maybe he had seen the error of his ways in the years since and regretted what he did with his daughter. Or maybe he was just trying to get into Cassandra's pants by standing up and trying to save her sister. The Greeks all thought it was the latter. And when he tried to argue, Odysseus was the one who convinced him to give it up. And Odysseus was the one who retrieved Polysena and brought her to her death, where he held her as Neoptolemus sacrificed her. Again, why do we like Odysseus? Oh, maybe we like Odysseus because he was given Hecuba, Priam's wife, and the former queen of Troy as his prize. And she, after having her husband and all of her friends and many of her children murdered in front of her, and the Greeks seeking to murder all the rest of her children, or, well, all the rest of her male children, while her daughters were being auctioned off as sex slaves, and she herself was now to become a sex slave. She didn't really like this arrangement of being given to Odysseus. And she apparently uttered such hideous insults and abuses at Odysseus that he saw no other alternative than to kill her. And he called her burial site the bitch's tomb. I mean, like, we all know that I hate Theseus, but like, Odysseus is rising in the ranks. So once they all had their prizes of war, the Greeks boarded their ships and left Troy, making their way back to their respective cities in Greece. So Antenor, as was promised when he betrayed Troy, was appointed as king of Troy. But honestly, like, Troy was really just a shadow of itself after the Trojan War. It never really got back to being this grand sort of city that it was before that. Now, for the main men of Greece and their stories. So Nestor just went back home to his life in Pylos. Some translation says that he was gone even before the sack of Troy. He was the only one who had like a relatively happy ending. He died old in his bed with like all of his children and his wives and people who loved him surrounding him. Yay for Nestor. Diomedes returned back home to Argos and found that his wife had been unfaithful to him. This was actually orchestrated by Aphrodite after he attacked her. His wife also raised some claims that maybe he shouldn't have been king of Argos, and people came and attacked him and almost killed him. So he sailed to what is now Italy and founded a city known as Argyripa. Calchas the seer died of a broken heart after he met a seer that was better than him. Neoptolemus left and became king of Epirus. He brought Andromache with him and they had multiple children, which I'm sure she was like super excited about. He was later killed by Apollo. He went to Delphi to see the oracle of Apollo and he demanded reparations from the god for killing his father Achilles. And when the oracle told him no, he plundered and burned the shrine down and then went to Sparta and yelled at Menelaus because he swore that Menelaus had promised him his daughter Hermione, but ended up giving her to Orestes, who we will get to in a moment. Menelaus ended up agreeing to allow Neoptolemus to marry Hermione, but Apollo cursed him and she never had any children. So he went back to the temple of Apollo and after some arguing and failed sacrifices, he was killed by a woman who Apollo pushed to commit the act. When Menelaus and Agamemnon were leaving Greece, they actually got into a really big fight and never saw each other again. The fight was basically about Agamemnon wanting to sacrifice to thank Athena for all of her help, and Menelaus saying no. This pissed off Athena, and she made Menelaus' voyage home terrible, but eventually he made it back to Sparta with Helen, and they ruled in Sparta until they died. And when that happened, they went to Elysium, which is sort of like paradise in the underworld where the warriors go. Odysseus did a lot of stuff. He has a whole epic written about him, which is the Odyssey. He fights a Cyclops. He encounters multiple gods and goddesses. He heads to the underworld, comes back from the underworld, listens to sirens, kills a bunch of people, and he's supposed to be a likable character. We'll probably do it at some point. Going over this whole like history and epic has been difficult at times, but I really enjoyed it. So I'll probably do the Odyssey at some point. I'll probably also do the Aeneid at some point, which is a story of Aeneas, which is, I think, the only major story about a Trojan that I can think of after the Trojan War. Most of the stories we hear about the Greeks. Aeneas ends up in Carthage and just like fucks up the lives of everyone there, and eventually goes to establish a city that eventually leads to the founding of Rome. But the biggest story of what happened to like the main warriors after the Trojan War, other than the Odyssey and the Aeneid, is what happened to Agamemnon. So at the beginning of the war, as we've already talked about, Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. Robert Graves wrote that Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had 4 children together. So they had a son, Orestes, and then 3 daughters, Electra, Chrysothemis, and Iphigenia, who we've of course discussed. But Robert Graves, who's like a really big person in mythology, wrote that there are some translations or stories that say that when Theseus abducted Helen, he assaulted her and she got pregnant and gave birth to Iphigenia, and Clytemnestra adopted her because she took pity on her sister and didn't want her reputation and life to be ruined having a baby out of wedlock. And I'm just like, oh my God, is that why Iphigenia was the one to be sacrificed and not one of the other daughters? Because like she wasn't actually the daughter of Agamemnon, so he had no like real affection and ties towards her, like biological. Like Agamemnon would be the kind of guy that would be like, I didn't stick my dick in you and got you pregnant with this kid, so like literally this kid doesn't matter to me. That's just, I just get those vibes from Agamemnon, so I could really see him thinking that way and being totally okay with sacrificing Iphigenia because of that. But regardless if Iphigenia was their child or not, Clytemnestra swore her revenge when he sacrificed Iphigenia, remember? So in the 10 years that he was gone, a lot happened in Mycenae. So I mean, without going into like a long tangent about like the house of Atreus and all of that, there was a man named Aegisthus whose family had a longtime feud with the family of Agamemnon and Menelaus, and they were fighting a lot for the throne of Mycenae. And so when the Greeks left for Troy, Aegisthus heard that Clytemnestra, queen of Mycenae and wife of Agamemnon, wanted to see Agamemnon dead for what he did to their daughter. She also didn't like him because she was initially married to a man named Tantalus, and Agamemnon killed him and then murdered her child with him and then married her by force. Super fine dude. So Aegisthus arrives in Mycenae with a lot of gifts and beautiful words to try and seduce the queen, but she initially rejected him. Not because she wasn't interested, she was, but because Agamemnon had appointed a member of his court to spy on her and report back to him if she was unfaithful at all. Let us not forget, Agamemnon has multiple like prizes in which he was not faithful to his wife during his absence, but as any alpha male podcast will tell you, that is not a problem, king. So Aegisthus found out that this was why she was rejecting him, so he grabbed the spy and marooned him on an island with no food, and then went straight to Clytemnestra's bed, and they ruled together for the 10 years that Agamemnon was gone. And then they received word that the war was over and everyone was coming home. And Agamemnon was not coming home alone. Oh no, he was coming home with Cassandra, who in the interim apparently had twins named Teledamas and Pelops. So when Agamemnon and Cassandra arrived back in Mycenae, Clytemnestra welcomed them. She rolled out an expensive purple carpet. She kissed her husband right on the mouth. She didn't even seem to be concerned about this new female companion and their children. Clytemnestra ushered them inside and told the slaves to prepare them a bath, but Cassandra wouldn't budge. She kept saying that she smelled blood, but she was ignored. Agamemnon went and took a bath. He got 1 foot out of the tub, and Clytemnestra came to him with a towel in her arms. But instead of wrapping him in it, she threw it over his head and entangled him in this net-like fabric that she had woven, and Aegisthus struck him twice with a sword, killing him. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus then went and killed Cassandra and her 2 babies, and she saw it all happen before they even left Troy. But of course, no one believed her. And that, my friends, is finally the end of the Trojan War. 50 single spaced pages of notes later, and we are done. We've laughed, we've cried, we've raged, we've discovered a lot of things, we've questioned a lot of things, we've come to hate people. Odysseus, I'm looking at you. We've come to like people. Achilles, looking at you. Maybe Diomedes. I'm still trying to figure out if I like Diomedes or not. It comes and goes. We've learned a lot. I hope that you enjoyed the product of the last 6 weeks of my life that resulted in this long and unnecessary deep dive into Troy and the Trojan War and all of the major players. I apologize. My voice seemed to kind of go out here at the end. It's allergy season up here in Massachusetts, and it's beautiful, and all the flowers are coming back, but my allergies are not liking it too much. Next time, we will be switching gears entirely and diving into a historical series about one of the most well-known royal families in English history. But until then, If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please leave a review, subscribe, join my Patreon, or just keep listening. I just love that you're here. Like, I just love you guys. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And for the love of the gods, somebody fucking listen to Cassandra. Bye.